Hello, my name is Angela Hahn. My website is knititude.com, www.knititude.com. And today we're going to be doing a couple of single row buttonholes. These are buttonholes where the complete buttonhole is done on one row versus another type of button row is a two-row buttonhole where the first part of the buttonhole is done on one row and then the second part of the buttonhole is done on the next row. I feel that the one-row buttonhole gives a neater finish. And it's also nice to get it done in just one row. So you can see I've marked the areas, the centers of the two buttonholes with a removable marker. So each buttonhole is going to be a 3-stitch buttonhole, and so I've marked the center stitch of the buttonhole. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to work in pattern. This happens to be 1 by 1 rib, knit 1, purl 1. So I'm going to work to 1 stitch before the marker. And as you can see here, I have 1 stitch and then the marker. I've actually placed the markers in the stitch below the stitch on the needle because it just makes it a lot easier to work the stitches on the needle if there isn't a marker in it. So I'm going to, now that I've gone to 1 stitch before the marked stitch, I'm going to bring the yarn to the front, slip the next stitch purlwise, and then bring the yarn to the back. I'm going to leave the yarn there. Okay, I'm going to slip the next stitch purlwise from the left hand needle, pass this slip stitched over it, and then I'm going to do that twice more. So slip the stitch purlwise, pass the previous stitch over it, and one more time. And as you can see, that's going to be the bottom part of the buttonhole. And then I'm going to take this 1 stitch that's still remaining on the right hand needle back to the left hand needle. So I'm just going to slip that back to the left hand needle. Now I'm going to turn the work to the wrong side. And I'm going to use this yarn that is still back here to cast on 4 stitches using what I call a sturdy cast on, but I'm going to do it by doing a purl type of stitch rather than a knit. And that means that on the front side, on the right side of the work, it will look like a knit stitch instead of a purl. So you'll see what I mean. So to do this, you act as if you're going to purl, but instead of putting the tip of the right hand needle into the stitch, you're actually going to put it between the first stitch on the needle and the second stitch on the needle. Pull the yarn through as if to create a purl stitch, and then I'm going to put that stitch back on the needle. Okay, I'm not going to pull it too tight because I'm going to do the same thing again 3 more times. So I'm going to act as if I'm purling, but put the needle tip between the stitch I just created and the previous stitch. Create a purl stitch, put it on the needle. I'm going to do it twice more. And you want to leave the tension a little bit loose so it's not so tight that it makes that impossible. And what this does, the reason I call it a sturdy cast on is because rather than a single strand of yarn, you have a double strand forming each stitch. See, I'm having a little trouble. So I'm going to loosen that stitch up a little bit. There we go. And then try and pass the needle. Okay. So that's the next one. And we have 1 more stitch that we want to create. I'm going to pass the needle tip between the stitch I just created and the one before, and then purl. So that's my 4 stitches cast on. Now I'm going to turn the work back to the right side. I'm going to slip the first stitch on the left hand needle to the right hand needle, and I'm going to pass this last cast on stitch over it, and that will actually close the buttonhole. So you can see I passed that last cast on stitch over that first stitch. You can see the buttonhole here. And now what I'm going to do is put that stitch back on the left hand needle, and I'm actually going to knit it. Okay, so I'm going to work a couple of stitches in pattern, and then we'll take a look at our finished buttonhole. And you can see we have a nice neat buttonhole there. Okay, so I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to repeat the whole process for this next buttonhole that I have, since I've worked to one stitch before the marked stitch. So we're going to do the whole thing one more time. So we bring the yarn to the front, slip the next stitch purlwise, bring the yarn to the back, leave it there, slip the next stitch purlwise, and then pass the previous stitch over it. 1, 2, I might have gotten just a partial strand of yarn there. Just want to make sure I got the whole strand of yarn. Okay, and one more time. 3. Okay. And then I'm going to slip this stitch that's remaining on the right hand needle back to the left hand needle. I'm going to turn to the wrong side, and using this yarn here, I'm going to cast on 4 stitches. So 1, using the sturdy cast on, passing the needle tip behind the first stitch rather than into the first stitch, and doing a purl stitch. 2, 3, and 4. So I actually, on the previous, when I started on the right side, I essentially bound off 3 stitches. And what I've just done is cast on 4, because the 4th stitch is actually going to be the stitch that closes the buttonhole. And so we end up with 3 stitches bound off and 3 stitches cast on. So now we have our 4 cast on stitches. We've turned the work back to the right side. I'm going to slip this stitch from this needle left hand to the right hand needle, pass the last cast on stitch over it. Just make sure you get only one stitch because they tend to clump together a bit. I'm going to pass. Let's see. Yeah, see, those are kind of sticking together. All right, there we go. We have one stitch. Pass it over the slip stitch to close the buttonhole. I'm going to put that stitch back on the left hand needle, and I'm going to knit it, and then I'll do a few more stitches in pattern. By the way, this is a cardigan pattern that will be published through Webb's Yarn, which is yarn.com. So there we have our second buttonhole. And there's our 2 buttonholes.